By the time the janitor found the error, his father had been dead for 48 hours, and no one at Westbridge even knew he'd left work to bury him. The night bled slowly over Westbridge University, pouring silver light over its stone courtyards. Inside Lecture Hall 3A, equations glowed pale against a blackboard that smelled of chalk and triumph. Dr. Helena Voss, 35, immaculate, terrifyingly precise, stood before her students like a high priestess of reason. Every symbol she wrote was an act of authority, the kind of authority that made others bow. "Observe the transformation at line 3, she said, the chalk tapping once, twice, in rhythm with her pulse. This substitution ensures symmetry in the boundary condition." A cough echoed from the back, a janitor's cough. He shouldn't have been there. Lucas Hale, 31, the night shift custodian, was mopping the marble aisle in silence. His uniform smelled faintly of detergent. His eyes, hollow from 2 sleepless nights, flicked once toward the board. He froze. Something in the equation didn't breathe right. He could feel it, the imbalance in the third line, the way one term twisted against the symmetry like a bone out of joint. For anyone else, it was invisible. For him, it screamed. He set the mop aside. "Excuse me," he said quietly, voice coarse from grief and lack of sleep. "You misapplied the variable change. Right there, in line 3. The room went deathly still. 30 graduate students turned at once, as if a fly had dared interrupt a ritual. Dr. Voss blinked, incredulous. "I'm sorry. What?" Lucas took one step closer to the blackboard. The smell of chalk hit him, the same scent that had filled his childhood home before the bank took it, the same scent on his father's hands when the old man taught him calculus on scrap paper between double shifts at the mill. He lifted a finger, trembling but certain. "You lost the negative in the Jacobian." A ripple of laughter. Someone whispered, "He thinks he knows calculus." But when Helena Voss turned back to the board, her own chalk paused mid-air. She checked the step. Once. Twice. The laughter died. There it was. An error. A small surgical flaw that toppled the entire proof. Outside, rain began to fall against the tall windows. The sound filled the silence like an accusation. "Get out," Helena said softly. "This is a graduate lecture, not open night for maintenance staff." Lucas hesitated. He could have left, apologized. Let the world continue believing it was whole. But something in him had broken 2 days earlier, standing beside a hospital bed, listening to the heart monitor flatten into a final, merciless tone. He looked at her, and for the first time in his life, he didn't step back. "No disrespect, ma'am," he said quietly, "but your symmetry breaks at line 3. You can't restore it downstream." For a moment, the air itself seemed to bend. Then Voss, too proud to retreat, forced a brittle smile. "And you're who, exactly?" "Maintenance," he said. "But I used to be in applied mathematics." He left before she could answer. Later that night, in the echo of the empty hallways, Lucas stood alone by the janitor's closet, hands shaking as he pulled a crumpled envelope from his pocket, the hospital discharge papers with his father's name, Arthur Hale, still smudged with rainwater and ash. He'd buried his father 2 days ago in a cheap pine coffin. No one from Westbridge came. He hadn't asked them to. Now he was back in the same building that had once expelled him for academic non-compliance. Back where his research, his father's dream, had died. He opened his locker. Behind bottles of floor cleaner and gloves lay a stack of notebooks, coffee-stained and half illegal, filled with partial proofs he'd never had time to finish. He flipped one open, and there it was, the same transformation Voss had botched. He whispered almost to himself, "Dad, You'd have seen it too. His reflection in the metal door looked like a ghost of the man he'd promised his father he'd become, a mathematician, a teacher, someone who could turn chaos into form. Instead, he was just a name on a payroll labeled custodial services. But the equation on that board, it wasn't about pride. It was about truth. And truth was the one thing that still made sense. The next morning, the story spread like wildfire. A janitor corrected Dr. Helena Voss. By noon, every corridor buzzed with gossip. By evening, Helena's teaching assistant had confirmed it. There had been an error. For most professors, it would have been a minor embarrassment. For Helena Voss, whose perfection was a religion, it was blasphemy. She reread her lecture notes, searching for justification. None came. And beneath the irritation, an emotion she hadn't felt in years began to surface. Doubt. She remembered his eyes, not defiant, not arrogant, just tired and unbearably honest. Who studies Jacobians while mopping floors? Meanwhile, Lucas slept sitting up in the break room. The rain outside turned to snow, blurring the lights of the city beyond the glass. He dreamed of his father again, of long evenings where equations replaced lullabies. "You see, Lucas," the old man would say, chalking lines on the back of a cereal box, "the beauty of symmetry is mercy. It forgives the mess if you balance it right." When he woke, there were tears on his face and chalk dust on his palms. He went back to cleaning. He had no time for miracles. But fate, that cruel mathematician, had already set her next equation in motion. At the other end of campus, Dr. Voss sat alone in her office, surrounded by framed diplomas and silence. The rain traced crooked integrals down the window pane. Her eyes lingered on the spot where the janitor had stood. His quiet certainty, his restraint. No arrogance, no pretense, just truth. And that truth, like a misplaced sign in an equation, had already begun to invert her entire life. Somewhere between the hum of the nightlights and the whisper of falling snow, two trajectories had crossed, one descending from pride, the other rising from grief. And neither knew that in less than a week, they would meet again on a stage where equations would decide not only a prize, but a heart. Morning at Westbridge University was a ceremony of privilege. Sunlight spilled through Gothic arches, warming the white columns that framed the courtyard like an open cathedral. Students in neatly pressed coats crossed the lawn with the confidence of those who had never been unseen. Their laughter echoed against walls engraved with donors' names, each a monument to inherited brilliance. Lucas Hale moved among them like a shadow that the architecture refused to acknowledge. His cart rattled over cobblestones polished by generations of scholars who had never once looked down to notice the hands that kept their world spotless. He had been one of them, once. Almost. Inside Arden Hall, Professor Helena Voss's portrait was being prepared for the faculty's upcoming brochure. She stood beside the photographer, her ivory suit immaculate, the light catching the faint silver thread in her hair. To the world, she was the definition of composure, sharp, beautiful, unshakably sure of her place. But that morning, something fragile haunted her reflection. The previous night's incident, the janitor's correction, refused to fade. She had spent half the night verifying the proof. Every check ended at the same truth. He had been right. A single missing sign, invisible to everyone but him. It shouldn't have mattered, yet it did. Because Helena Voss built her identity on perfection, and one imperfection, exposed by a man in overalls, had cracked the marble. Down the hall, Lucas emptied bins filled with crumpled research drafts and half-eaten sandwiches. The smell of disinfectant mixed with coffee and ink. His hands moved automatically, but his mind wasn't in the room. It lingered in the silence after he'd spoken up, in the way 30 pairs of eyes had stared at him as if a dog had spoken Latin. He could still see Dr. Voss's expression, contempt first, then something worse, recognition. He'd promised himself never to draw attention again. But grief does strange things to silence. 2 days ago, he had been standing by his father's hospital bed, the monitors whispering statistics of defeat. Arthur Hale, once a high school teacher who believed that mathematics could save the world, had died clutching a letter from Westbridge, the same university that had expelled his son 5 years earlier for unauthorized access to restricted research servers. Lucas hadn't hacked anything malicious. He had simply refused to stop studying after losing his scholarship. He'd used an old faculty password to keep reading journals, driven by hunger to understand the equations that could make turbines sing and bridges breathe. Westbridge didn't call it hunger. They called it theft. Arthur never forgave himself for not protecting him. Now the father was gone, the son mopping floors for the same people who had erased his name from their system. That afternoon, while students discussed the upcoming ArcLight challenge, Lucas sat alone on the stone steps behind the mechanical lab, staring at the fountain that no one ever touched in winter. His father's voice replayed like static through his memory. "The world will tell you that brilliance belongs to the polished, son, but chalk and grease remember what silk forgets." He smiled bitterly. Maybe brilliance wasn't enough. Not when credentials were the currency of worth. The wind shifted, carrying laughter from a group of graduate students nearby. "The janitor, can you believe it? He corrected Dr. Voss. I heard she nearly choked." "Did he even go to college?" "No idea. Probably cleans one." Their laughter trailed off, replaced by the quiet scrape of Lucas's broom. He didn't look up. He'd learned long ago that dignity sometimes meant not giving them the show they wanted. That evening, Dr. Voss returned to her office in Lambrecht Hall, where the walls gleamed with framed degrees: Harvard, Cambridge, Göttingen. Each certificate was a story of triumph, she told herself whenever doubt dared to speak. But tonight, even those credentials couldn't drown the whisper of last night's voice. "Your symmetry breaks at line 3. Her assistant had assured her it was nothing. He probably memorized it from somewhere. But the precision of his correction haunted her. It was the kind of mistake only someone who understood could see. She poured a glass of wine, but her hand trembled slightly. Perfection had always been her armor. Now it felt like glass. Lucas's dorm was a storage closet converted into a restroom for maintenance staff. On the shelf above his bed sat a single framed photo. His father holding a box of chalk and grinning like a man who'd just solved the universe. Lucas opened his notebook and stared at the half-finished equations he'd been working on before the hospital called. They were supposed to model turbulent flow decay, a problem he'd obsessed over for years, a small rebellion against the same academic system that had dismissed him. He began writing again, the pencil trembling over the paper. But halfway through, his vision blurred. He pressed his forehead against his knees and let the silence wash over him. "You're not supposed to grieve in universities," he thought. "Only publish." Meanwhile, in the faculty dining hall, Helena Voss was surrounded by colleagues. The air smelled of expensive wine and victory. She smiled on cue, answered questions, nodded at compliments. But beneath the polite laughter, her mind kept circling back to the man with tired eyes who had dared correct her. Why had she been so furious? Because he'd humiliated her, or because for the first time she'd seen sincerity uncorrupted by ambition? Outside, the snow had thickened, covering the campus in a hush that felt almost sacred. Lucas wheeled his cart through the empty corridors, each lamp flickering like a dying equation. He paused before the mathematics department office, its brass plate gleaming under the fluorescent light. Helena Voss, Ph.D., department chair. He almost knocked, almost told her he was sorry. But then he remembered his father's funeral, the absence of letters from Westbridge, the silence that had followed his dismissal. So he turned away, leaving behind only the faint scent of ammonia and the echo of wheels rolling across ivory floors. And yet, destiny is drawn to symmetry. The next time Helena Voss and Lucas Hale met, the line between genius and janitor would vanish beneath the weight of a single piece of chalk, and a promise no one meant to keep. The corridors of Westbridge University gleamed like the inside of an ivory shell. Polished glass, golden plaques, whispers of prestige. At the far end of the mathematics building, light poured from a half-open door where Dr. Helena Voss was conducting her weekly seminar. Advanced variational methods in non-linear systems. Lucas Hale, mop and bucket in hand, paused at the threshold. He hadn't planned to stop. He only meant to empty the bin and move on. But the moment he heard the sound of chalk against slate, something inside him stilled. That sound, the dry hiss of truth being born, had once been his heartbeat. Helena's voice filled the room. "This integral defines the stability condition for anisotropic energy states," she said, elegance sharpened into command. "You will find that the boundary symmetry ensures uniqueness. The trick lies in isolating the Lagrange term." The students scribbled furiously. Lucas leaned his cart against the wall. His eyes followed the proof like someone tracing constellations he'd memorized as a child. And then he saw it. Not an error this time, but an opportunity. There was a faster route, simpler, more beautiful. He shouldn't have spoken. He knew that. But beauty, once glimpsed, demands voice. "Excuse me, Professor," he said softly. "There's a cleaner approach, if you exploit the symmetry instead of forcing the condition." The room froze. Helena turned, startled by the interruption. Her brow arched, eyes cold as the marble steps outside. "Mr. Hale, is it? I believe your expertise is in sanitation, not symplectic geometry." A wave of laughter rolled through the room. Lucas flushed but stood firm. "I mean no disrespect. You're integrating over an odd boundary. The symmetry cancels half the work. You can rewrite it directly." "Rewrite?" Helena repeated, tone laced with ice. "Do enlighten us. I'm sure my graduate students could use a janitorial perspective on advanced topology." Her words drew scattered applause, not of admiration, but mockery. But Lucas didn't flinch. He walked to the board uninvited, chalk trembling between his fingers. He began not where she had started, but where she had refused to look, the core structure of the integral itself. 2 lines in, the noise in the room died. 5 lines in, the pattern emerged, symmetry folding upon itself like wings. When he stepped back, the entire blackboard breathed clarity. Even the most skeptical students stared, awed by the precision, the ease, the elegance. "You see," Lucas said gently, "you don't need to force it. The equation balances itself if you let it." For a heartbeat, Helena's composure cracked. Her throat tightened with something she refused to name. Admiration, maybe. Or fear. Then pride returned like armor. "Fascinating," she said coldly. "Tell you what, Mr. Hale. Since you seem so confident in your artistic approach, let's raise the stakes." She turned back to the board and, with deliberate cruelty, began writing a problem that no one in the room recognized, not even her own students. A dense, non-linear boundary equation, a monster of her own making. When she finished, she set down the chalk with theatrical grace. "Solve this, and I'll marry you." The room erupted in laughter. Lucas stood motionless. The equation stared back at him, lines of symbols twisting like a taunt from fate. He recognized it almost instantly. It was from her doctoral thesis, a problem she had struggled with for years before publishing a partial result. The mockery wasn't just public, it was surgical. For a moment, he thought of his father, the hospital bed, the chalk, the whispered encouragement. Even in humiliation, look for the structure, son. That's where beauty hides. He looked at the board again, and something in him hardened into calm. He stepped forward, took the chalk, and began. The first few symbols landed like steady footsteps through fire. Gasps filled the room. The elegance of his approach was undeniable. No hesitation, no guessing. Only the certainty of a man who saw the truth beneath layers of pretense. Helena's smile faltered. She moved closer, trying to find a flaw. There was none. The entire proof, 3 years of her doctoral agony, unfolded effortlessly under his hand. He even corrected a minor assumption she'd published wrong a decade ago. When he finished, he placed the chalk on the tray. Your equation converges cleanly under the boundary, he said quietly. You just needed to let it minimize its own energy. Helena stepped forward, scanning each line, her lips parting. Every term was right, every limit correct, every symbol flawless. The laughter died into stunned silence. She looked at him, pale. How did you know that method? He smiled faintly. You learn to see shortcuts when life doesn't give you time for long proofs. For the first time in her career, Helena Voss couldn't find a word. That night, the campus shook with whispers. The janitor solved her problem. The professor's joke backfired. They said she'd promised to marry him. Students replayed the moment in endless retellings. Some laughed, some admired. But one thing was certain. The hierarchy had cracked. Helena sat alone in her office, staring at her reflection in the dark window. Her pride was bleeding, but beneath the sting, something strange flickered. Curiosity. Who was this man? How could someone without access to journals, advisors, or grants solve in minutes what took her years? She tried to dismiss it as luck, mimicry, stolen methods. But the memory of his hand, calm, precise, compassionate, refused to fade. And beneath it all pulsed a quiet terror. If he's real, then everything I believe about intelligence is a lie. Down in the maintenance room, Lucas sat on a folding chair, staring at his father's old notebook. The same one where, years ago, he'd written the words, "The shortest path between two truths is often kindness." He smiled bitterly. If only mathematics could teach people that. Outside, the storm over Westbridge broke, washing the campus clean. And somewhere in the dark, beneath the marble towers of intellect, the first glimmer of revolution began, carried not by scholars, but by a man with calloused hands and the courage to lift the chalk. By morning, the story would spread across every faculty hall. A janitor's hand against an empire of pride, and in the ivory walls of Westbridge, the first fracture had appeared. Morning rose over Westbridge University with cruel precision. The campus, so proud of its symmetry, looked the same as always. Marble steps scrubbed clean, ivy curling along the cloisters, the air smelling faintly of rain and arrogance. But something invisible had shifted. Students whispered between lectures, professors spoke in half-voices at coffee stations, and every corridor echoed with the same incredulous phrase, "He solved it in 5 minutes." Dr. Helena Voss stood before her mirror, her reflection immaculate, hair pinned, ivory blouse uncreased, expression serene. But the mirror was a liar. Inside, she was shaking. She had spent the night reviewing his work. Every symbol, every boundary, every derivation. There was no error, Worse, there was grace. The kind that only appears when someone truly understands, not when they merely perform. Her PhD thesis, the foundation of her academic throne, had just been outshone by a man in work boots. She sat on the edge of her bed, staring at her hands. Hands that had signed 100 recommendation letters, written 50 publications, and rejected 20 applications from underqualified candidates. Now they trembled. "He couldn't have done it alone," she whispered. "He must have seen my papers. He must have memorized it. He must have—" But each excuse died against the same silent wall, the beauty of the proof. Meanwhile, Lucas Hale was back in the shadows where he belonged, or where the world insisted he belonged. He worked through the night shift, collecting garbage from offices still perfumed with authority. Each trash can told a story: discarded coffee cups from PhD students, failed drafts of grant proposals, burnt-out pens, the byproducts of genius. He'd been invisible so long that even the gossip about him felt unreal. At breakfast, a pair of undergrads had pointed and laughed. "That's him," one said. "The janitor mathematician, the one she said she'd marry." Lucas had smiled politely, but inside something ancient and tired stirred. It wasn't pride. It wasn't anger. It was the hollow echo of recognition, that even miracles become entertainment when performed by the wrong man. By noon, the Department of Mathematics convened an emergency faculty meeting. The agenda: professional conduct and academic standards. Helena sat at the head of the table, chin lifted like a queen in exile. Around her, professors debated in brittle tones. "This kind of spectacle damages our reputation. If we let maintenance staff challenge professors, what precedent does that set? We must ensure academic boundaries remain clear." Helena's jaw clenched. She should have agreed with them. 5 years of departmental politics had trained her to. But as they spoke, she found herself silent, lost in the memory of Lucas's handwriting on the board, unhurried, unpretentious, alive. Boundaries, she thought. That's all we ever talk about, as if intellect were a fence instead of a field. That evening, she took a detour on her walk back to the parking lot. Through the glass walls of Arden Hall, she saw him. Lucas was mopping the corridor floor, sleeves rolled to his elbows, chalk dust still faint on his hands. For a moment, she hesitated. The sight of him stirred something raw, humility maybe, or guilt. She pushed the door open. He looked up, startled. "Professor Voss?" She almost corrected him, almost said Helena, but the word stuck in her throat. "I reviewed your solution," she said, voice steady but softer than usual. "You were correct." Lucas nodded. "I know." Her eyes flicked to the mop. "You shouldn't waste your time here." "Where else would I go?" he asked quietly. "I tried before. Westbridge closed that door a long time ago." "Then apply again." "I did," he said. "You were the one who rejected it." The silence that followed was so heavy, it could have shattered glass. Helena's pulse faltered. She remembered that name now. Hale, Lucas A. The application she'd dismissed 3 years ago without reading beyond the first line. Former student, dismissed for unauthorized research access. She had written one word in the margin. Unfit. Now he stood before her, calm and unbroken, holding a mop like a staff of quiet dignity. "I'm sorry," she said, the words tasting strange on her tongue. He smiled faintly. "Don't be. The floor still needs cleaning." She wanted to say more, to ask who had taught him, to tell him that his proof had reminded her why she'd fallen in love with mathematics in the first place. But pride is a cage built of gold. She left, instead. That night, Helena sat by her office window long after the lights went out. Outside, the snow was beginning again, soft, relentless, indifferent. She thought of her father, a man who'd worked his whole life to send her here. He used to say, "The world doesn't owe you recognition, only the chance to earn it." But what if the world refused to see who was earning it? Her gaze drifted to the blackboard still marked with Lucas's handwriting. Something inside her, the part that had been petrified by success, began to thaw. Maybe genius wasn't rare. Maybe we just buried it under credentials. Down in the janitor's quarters, Lucas lay awake, staring at the flickering light. He could still feel the cold of her silence, the sting of her apology. He didn't hate her, not really. He pitied the world that made her believe compassion was weakness and doubt was failure. He opened his father's notebook and wrote a single line under a faded sketch of an integral curve. Walls keep out danger, but they also keep out light. By week's end, Westbridge would host the ArcLight Challenge, Helena as its judge, Lucas as its quiet ghost. But walls built on arrogance have a way of cracking when the right equation touches them. And this time, the chalk would fall on both sides. The announcement hit campus like thunder. The ArcLight Challenge. $50,000 plus automatic PhD admission. To win was to ascend. To lose was to be forgotten. By dawn, posters covered every bulletin board, every cafe window, every corridor that smelled faintly of coffee and ambition. It was Westbridge's grand ritual, the proving ground where professors paraded prodigies and prodigies paraded pride. And this year, the chair of the board, Dr. Helena Voss, would preside over it all. Helena arrived early to the main auditorium, her heels clicking like a metronome of control. The hall shimmered. Gold lamps, scarlet velvet seats, banners embroidered with equations that few outside the university could read. To her, this place was sacred. A cathedral of intellect, a fortress against chaos. And yet for the first time in her career, she could feel the tremor beneath its marble floor, the ghost of a janitor's chalk. Outside the hall, Lucas Hale was watching the sunrise from the maintenance yard. The snow on the bins reflected light like crushed glass. His shift had ended an hour ago, but he hadn't gone home. He still had his father's worn notebook in his coat pocket, its pages yellowed, corners bent, a lifetime of half-finished dreams. On the last page, the handwriting faltered but clear enough to read, "The world is divided by doors. Knock until one opens. If none do, build one yourself." Lucas touched the page as if it were a pulse. He had filled out the entry form 2 nights ago, handwriting neat, quiet, careful. Name, Lucas A. Hale. Affiliation, Maintenance Department, Westbridge University. He hadn't expected acceptance. He only wanted to see if truth still had a door. That afternoon, Helena held the press briefing. Reporters filled the atrium, microphones ready, cameras humming like a mechanical swarm. "Dr. Voss," one asked, "is it true that anyone affiliated with the university may participate?" "Technically, yes," she said, smiling a smile that could slice glass. "But mathematics at this level requires years of formal preparation. I would hate to see anyone embarrass themselves." She glanced subtly toward the back of the room. Lucas had come to clean between the rows of chairs. Their eyes met for the briefest moment. The meaning was clear. Don't try. When the registration list was released that evening, the name Lucas A. Hale appeared at the bottom. Line number 13. Some laughed, others frowned, but within minutes, social media had seized on it. The janitor's back. The video of his Marry Me challenge had already reached 2 million views. Westbridge's elite laughed, but the world outside was listening. The next morning, the main auditorium filled with an electric kind of silence. Students in designer coats, professors in tailored suits, every seat occupied. Helena stepped to the podium, voice ringing clear. Welcome to the ArcLight Challenge, a celebration of the highest order of mathematical excellence. Here, intellect meets discipline, talent meets training, and above all, truth meets merit. Polite applause followed. The words tasted like polished stone. Behind her, 12 contestants sat in a neat row, doctoral candidates from elite programs, each surrounded by laptops, mechanical pencils, and the scent of expensive ink. And then there was the 13th chair, empty for a moment, until Lucas entered, still in his maintenance uniform, a folded notebook tucked in his pocket. He looked like a ghost who had wandered into the wrong century. Whispers rippled through the audience. Is he serious? Why is he even here? Maybe it's charity. Helena's lips tightened. She could have disqualified him quietly. There were ways, but something stopped her. Maybe pity. Maybe guilt. Maybe the same dangerous curiosity that once led her to love the unknown. She adjusted the microphone. Let the first round begin. The problem appeared on the massive screen behind her, proved that the sum of the first n odd numbers equals n2. It was almost laughably simple, a warm-up meant to separate the confident from the lost. The graduate students went to work immediately, filling pages with formal proofs, induction, algebraic series, symbolic logic. Their pens flew like machinery. Lucas didn't move. He stood still, looking at the pattern as if listening to it. Then, slowly, he approached his board and began to draw dots, small, patient, deliberate. Rows of 1, 3, 5, 7, forming squares. When he stepped back, the picture spoke for him. You don't need equations to see it, he said softly. Each layer adds an odd number of stones, and every layer completes the square. Math isn't about calculation. It's about seeing. The audience went silent. Then applause, hesitant at first, then thunderous. Even Helena felt it, that forgotten warmth of clarity, the beauty of simplicity, but she couldn't show it. Creative, she said tightly. But we require formal rigor. Dr. Miriam Adler, guest judge from the Northlake Institute, leaned toward her microphone. On the contrary, Dr. Voss, she said, smiling. That was perfect rigor, in geometry's first language. The crowd erupted again. Helena's throat went dry. She could feel the walls of merit beginning to tremble. By evening, the internet had already christened him. #the Janitor Genius. Clips of his explanation circulated with subtitles in 10 languages. Messages poured in from high school teachers, from factory workers, from kids who hated math until they saw it move. Helena shut her office blinds against the noise. She tried to work, to reclaim her calm, but the reflection in the window betrayed her. A woman who'd spent her life building walls, now watching a man without a title walk straight through them. For the first time, she felt something she could not name. Fear. Admiration. Or maybe the faint, terrible joy of realizing that truth had never needed her permission. Down in the janitor's quarters, Lucas reread the rules of the challenge. 3 rounds, increasing difficulty. 12 opponents with doctorates, 1 man without a degree. He traced the inked words on his father's letter. Knock until one opens. Then he smiled to himself and whispered, Looks like one just did. Outside, snow fell in perfect silence, white, endless, unjudging. By tomorrow it would cover the campus like an eraser over chalk. But beneath that thin, cold veil, a new equation had begun to form, one that no one at Westbridge could control. The day of the ArcLight Challenge dawned white and windless. Snow fell like dust from a shaken heaven, coating the towers of Westbridge in silence. Inside, however, the air trembled. 12 contestants filled the grand auditorium, each bearing the insignia of brilliance: Harvard, Ardent, Calmore, Northlake. And then there was the 13th seat, occupied by a man in a janitor's uniform, his hands calloused, his notebook paper-thin from overuse. Lucas Hale. Dr. Helena Voss stood at the judge's table, flanked by colleagues and visiting scholars. She had chosen the day's problems herself. 3 escalating tests meant to measure mathematical maturity. In truth, they were designed to measure belonging, to separate those who looked the part from those who merely dared. Her gaze swept over the contestants like a blade. She saw Derek Finch from Ardent University, confident and polished. Sarah Whitmore, her own doctoral student, already published twice before graduation. And then Lucas, sitting quietly, his mop leaning against the wall behind him. Something inside her twisted. Guilt? Fear. She pushed it down. "Round 1 begins," she said into the microphone. 3 problems, 90 minutes. Full rigor required. The first question glowed on the screen behind her. Find the maximum value of the function fxy, il x tui, under the constraint 2x plus 3y, x 12. A warm-up. Textbook calculus. The room filled with the scratching of pens. Graduate students bent over notebooks, eliminating variables, solving with multipliers. Helena's lips curved faintly. These were the predictable rhythms of the educated mind. Until she noticed Lucas. He wasn't calculating. He was drawing. His pencil traced the curve of the constraint, an elegant line cutting through the coordinate plane. Then, lightly, he drew a tangent. The geometric reasoning was effortless, the point of tangency between constraint and objective. He didn't solve for beauty. He saw it. 5 minutes later, he set down his pencil. When Helena reviewed his paper, her breath caught. No wasted symbols, no clutter, just one diagram, annotated with quiet confidence. At equilibrium, the gradient of f is parallel to the constraint line. Nothing more. Nothing less. Perfect. The second problem appeared, denser, sharper. Given a 4x4 matrix A with orthogonal eigenvectors, prove that A is diagonalizable over R. Every graduate student smiled. Finally, a real question. Lucas did too, though for a different reason. He had seen this in his father's notes, back when they studied linear algebra together on the kitchen table with chalk and cutting boards for blackboards. He remembered the smell of fried onions and graphite, his father's voice warm. "Symmetry, son, is not decoration. It's structure. And structure means freedom." He closed his eyes, whispering the steps to himself like prayer. Within 10 minutes, his proof was complete. It wasn't dressed in academic pomp. It was bare, pure, luminous. When Dr. Miriam Adler, guest judge from Northlake, reviewed it, she smiled. "The notation is unorthodox," she whispered. "But the logic, flawless." Helena's jaw tightened. "It's informal." "It's beautiful," Adler replied. "Sometimes that's the same thing." The third question appeared, a historical trap. Evaluate the infinite series. 1, 1/3 plus 1, 5, 1, 7 plus up to infinity. A murmur of recognition. It was the Leibniz formula for P4, but the twist was hidden. A modified denominator in the 10th term. Most contestants overcomplicated it, diving into Fourier approximations or partial sums. Lucas flipped his page, smiled faintly, and began to speak softly, almost to himself. "You can't find infinity by chasing it. You have to listen to how it repeats. He wrote the alternating pattern as a visual curve, shaded the symmetry, and with a few lines derived the correction term elegantly. The number P appeared at the bottom like a secret revealed. The adjustment balanced perfectly. When the timer rang, half the contestants had unfinished papers. Lucas simply capped his pen. Silence, then whispers. Helena reviewed the submissions one by one. Every formula from the top schools: competent, mechanical, safe. Then she came to his. No excess, no footnotes, no citations, just thought distilled to essence. She should have felt admiration. Instead, she felt threatened. A foreign thought clawed its way into her mind. What if the world starts believing he belongs here? Her entire life, the degrees, the discipline, the years of polished certainty, balanced on that question. When results were announced, she forced her voice into calm. All contestants advanced to the semifinals, she said. But she avoided Lucas's eyes. The audience murmured, restless, curious. Dr. Adler leaned toward her. Helena, she said softly, you can't pretend not to see what's in front of you. I see a man out of his depth, Helena replied. But the words rang hollow. Later that night, after the hall emptied, Helena lingered in the dark. She replayed every movement of his hand on the board. The quiet authority, the gentle patience. It was the kind of confidence that didn't need applause, and that terrified her more than any humiliation. Outside, the wind howled through the colonnades. Inside, the walls of Westbridge whispered. Old voices of pride. Old ghosts of exclusion. And somewhere deep inside her, a crack widened. Down in the maintenance hall, Lucas cleaned the marble stairs where students had mocked him hours before. Each stroke of his mop erased footprints, leaving only reflection. He looked up at the ceiling, where chandeliers shimmered like constellations. Dad, he murmured, I made it back to the board. He opened his father's notebook again, tracing the faded line written years ago. If truth scares them, son, don't argue. Just write it brighter. He smiled, set the mop aside, and took out a stub of chalk. On the dark corner of a maintenance wall, he drew a single symbol, the sign for infinity. It glowed faintly under the emergency light. The chalk dared to stay. By morning, the internet would name him the chalk that dared. And by the semi-finals, even Helena's fortress of logic would start to crumble beneath something she had never accounted for: humility. Snow had melted into a thin, glassy rain by the morning of the semifinals. The sky above Westbridge University hung low and colorless, like the moment before confession. But inside the auditorium, lights, cameras, microphones, and 4,000 eyes waited for the same thing: to see Lucas Hale fail. Even those who admired him expected it. Miracles, after all, aren't supposed to repeat. Helena Voss stood behind the podium, her voice steady but her heart unmoored. The air around her carried a strange electricity, admiration mixed with resentment. The challenge had become bigger than the university, bigger than her. Every news outlet, every live stream, every academic forum was watching. She had built this test to crown the most brilliant mind of her generation. Now it might expose the cracks in her own. The semi-final problem appeared on the screen. Determine whether the infinite series S, 1 and N2, converges or diverges, and describe its behavior. Simple in appearance, deceptive in structure. It required mastery of mathematical analysis, convergence, limits, asymptotic reasoning, things Lucas shouldn't know. Helena's plan was elegant in its cruelty. This wasn't just about solving, it was about presentation, about knowing how to speak in the language of the elite. The contestants went to work. Graduate students scribbled furiously, writing out epsilon delta proofs and bounding sequences with formal notation. Helena watched from the panel, her mind half absorbed in calculation, half tuned to the quiet sound of chalk at the far corner. Lucas wasn't writing words. He was drawing curves again. At first, the audience laughed softly until they saw the pattern. He plotted each term as a bar descending from a baseline, 1, 1/4, 1/9, 1/16, forming a staircase that approached the ground but never quite touched. Then he shaded the space under a smooth curve connecting them. "This," he said quietly, "is how infinity behaves when it learns restraint. Each step smaller, softer, until the pattern becomes harmony. That's convergence." The audience fell silent. It wasn't the precision of his math that stunned them. It was the clarity. He wasn't speaking to impress. He was teaching. Helena's pen froze mid-air. That tone, that calm certainty, she had heard it before, years ago, in a classroom at Cambridge. A young professor once told her, "Real mathematicians explain beauty, not just logic." That professor had been her mentor, and he had died believing intellect was a light meant to be shared, not hoarded. And now that same light shone from a man holding chalk with scarred hands. When the timer rang, most contestants still debated over proofs. Lucas simply stepped back, chalk dust on his fingers like starlight. He didn't look triumphant, only calm. Dr. Miriam Adler leaned toward her microphone, voice warm. "Mr. Hale, that was extraordinary. Your proof is correct, and your explanation made it understandable to everyone in this room." Applause rippled through the hall. Helena's lips parted, but no words came. She had no critique that didn't sound hollow. After the round, reporters flooded the campus courtyard. Cameras chased Lucas down the marble steps, microphones shouting questions. "How did you learn this? Who taught you? What's next for you?" He smiled politely, saying almost nothing. When they asked what inspired his approach, he simply replied, "I don't solve problems to win. I solve them to understand." That line would be quoted in journals the next morning. That night, Helena couldn't sleep. The rain tapped against her window like a metronome of guilt. On her desk lay 2 papers, her own doctoral work on complex systems, dense, mechanical, lifeless, and Lucas's 3 pages from today, clear, minimal, radiant. She realized she had forgotten what it felt like to write with wonder. In the mirror, she saw not a scholar, but a gatekeeper, and the reflection frightened her. Meanwhile, Lucas returned to the janitor's dormitory, the smallest room on campus, half lit by a flickering bulb. He removed his uniform jacket, hung it carefully, and pulled out his father's notebook again. Rain pattered through the cracked window. He read an old note written in rough pencil. "When people stop seeing beauty in numbers, it's not math that's lost. It's them." He looked up at the water dripping down the window glass, tracing it with his finger like plotting another curve. Outside, the tower lights of Westbridge gleamed like distant constellations, unreachable, yet real. Back in her office, Helena sat before an empty email draft addressed to the university board. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. "Should we allow non-academic personnel to continue in the challenge?" she had written earlier. Now, she erased it. In its place, she typed, "Sometimes the truest proof is not in the equation, but in the courage to write it." Then she closed the laptop and leaned back, exhaling for what felt like the first time in years. By morning, rumors would whisper through Westbridge. Voss defended the janitor. And by the time the final round began, the walls between professor and worker, between title and truth, would start to fall. Because for the first time, Helena Voss was no longer afraid of the light. The morning of the final day broke bright and brittle. Snow had stopped, but the air outside Westbridge was sharp enough to taste. Students filled the courtyards with rumors, phones raised, whispering one name over and over: Lucas Hale. Inside, the auditorium was being prepared for the grand finale. Television crews adjusted lights. Reporters rehearsed headlines. Even the dean, who usually avoided anything too public, sat in the front row, his expression unreadable. Dr. Helena Voss stood behind the curtain, hands clasped so tightly that her knuckles whitened. She had not slept. The truth was simple. She could not lose control of this story. Not to him. Not to the man who had cracked her certainty like glass. That morning, a meeting had taken place in her office, behind closed doors, shades drawn. The dean, her colleague Dr. Rennick, and a few members of the mathematics board. Their tone was formal, their message clear. If the janitor wins, Westbridge becomes a circus. We cannot have the world believing anyone can walk off the street and outthink our faculty. Helena had tried to argue, her voice trembling more than she intended. But the competition's rules are open to all. The mathematics must speak for itself. The dean's reply cut like ice. Then make sure the mathematics speaks the right language. The implication was unmistakable. If Lucas Hale couldn't be disqualified, he would be crushed. Hours later, as the audience filed in, Helena stared at the final exam on her desk. A 3-part research problem derived from her own doctoral dissertation. She had rewritten it overnight, turning it into something cruelly impossible. Even a tenured professor would need weeks to solve it. And yet, the guilt that had been gnawing at her since the first round was now roaring in her chest. She had become the thing she once despised, the gatekeeper who mistook cruelty for rigor. Lucas entered quietly, still wearing his faded uniform. He looked tired, not from fear, but from the weight of meaning. The world was watching, but he didn't care about that. He cared about keeping a promise, to his late father, and to the belief that truth should never wear a badge. Dr. Miriam Adler, seated beside Helena, leaned forward. "Helena," she whispered, "this isn't fair." "I'm maintaining standards," Helena replied softly, but her own voice trembled. When the challenge began, silence fell. 3 massive whiteboards stood on stage. Lucas faced the middle one, the hardest, the heaviest, the one she'd written for him. The question loomed across the projector. Solve and justify the boundary conditions for the nonlinear differential equation governing f(x), where the functional form exhibits self-adjoint properties in Hilbert space. To most, it looked like another language. Even the professors in the audience frowned. Helena's heart pounded. This was the trap. No janitor could survive this. For 30 minutes, Lucas stared at the equation. His hand didn't move. His mind raced through everything he had ever studied. Every theorem, every shadow of memory from nights spent reading his father's scribbles beside a broken lamp. He could almost hear his father's voice. "When you can't see the pattern, stop chasing the light. Step back. Let the dark shape it for you." He took a deep breath, then erased everything he'd written so far. The audience murmured. Helena watched, confusion mixing with something dangerously close to admiration. He wasn't giving up. He was changing direction. Instead of advanced modern methods, Lucas began with simplicity. He drew the graph by hand, marked the constraints, and applied an older tool, the variational method, a classical approach nearly forgotten in contemporary analysis. He spoke softly as he worked, his words filling the hall. "You don't have to master every tool to find truth. You just have to understand what it's trying to say." Helena's breath caught. She recognized the logic instantly. It was from a style of teaching abandoned decades ago, the same style used by her old mentor, Dr. Tobias Adler, Miriam's late husband. Miriam sat upright, realization flooding her face. She whispered, almost to herself, "Helena, this man was Tobias's student." The room seemed to tilt. The audience watched in absolute silence as Lucas's chalk moved faster, smoother, more certain. He was reconstructing an entire method. One thought lost when Tobias Adler died. Every line glowed with clarity. Every curve sang of purpose. When the timer hit 90 minutes, he stepped back. The proof was done. Elegant. Complete. Impossible. Helena rose from her seat, her eyes wide with disbelief and awe. She could no longer tell if the tears in her eyes were from humiliation or reverence. Dr. Adler approached the board, scanning the work. Each line mirrored the precision of Tobias's original research. She turned to the crowd, her voice breaking. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you see here isn't imitation. It's rediscovery. This man has just revived an entire mathematical lineage thought lost for 30 years. The hall erupted, cameras flashed, students cheered. But in the middle of it all, Helena stood motionless, her entire world unmade. That evening, Westbridge's name filled every headline. Janitor solves lost equation. Forgotten student revives Professor Adler's method. The day Westbridge learned humility. Helena sat alone in her office long after everyone had left. The problem she'd written to destroy him now lay on her desk, solved perfectly. For the first time, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Peace in defeat. She whispered to herself, maybe the tower wasn't meant to stand forever. Down in the maintenance hall, Lucas packed his things quietly. He had no interest in fame. He just wanted a letter from the board saying he could study again. As he turned off the light, he noticed someone standing at the doorway, Helena, coat dusted with snow. She looked at him with the humility of someone who had finally learned to see. "You rebuilt something today," she said softly. "Not just mathematics, but us." He smiled faintly. "Then maybe the world can start over too." By morning, offers would pour in from universities across the world. But the greatest revelation was yet to come, one hidden deep within an old MIT record, where a student named Lucas Hale had once been marked withdrawn for personal reasons. And in the signature line, the advisor's name, Tobias Adler. The morning after the ArcLight Challenge, Westbridge University awoke into silence, the kind that follows after an earthquake. Snow gleamed on the lawns like powdered glass. Reporters camped by the main gate. Students whispered in corridors, still echoing with applause from the night before. And at the heart of it all, two names pulsed through every conversation: Lucas Hale, Helena Voss. Inside the administrative wing, Helena walked alone, carrying a file she had requested from the records office. She had barely slept, her thoughts replaying every moment of the competition. His voice, his reasoning, the quiet authority that defied everything she had been taught about hierarchy. The receptionist had warned her earlier, "These archives are from before the digital system, Doctor. Some files are incomplete." She nodded. "That's fine. I'm not looking for a record. I'm looking for a ghost." The room was cold and dust-scented. Stacks of paper towered like tombstones. Helena set the old file on the table. The manila folder was faded, the corners torn. Stamped across the front, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, 2013. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside were transcripts, recommendation letters, and one signature that froze her heart. Advisor, Professor Tobias Adler, her late mentor, Miriam Adler's husband, the man who had once told her that mathematics should never belong to the privileged. Lucas Hale had been one of his final doctoral students. His coursework, flawless. His publications, 2 papers on classical variational analysis, co-authored with Adler himself. The last entry read, "Status, withdrawn. Family medical emergency. Thesis incomplete." Attached to the file was a short, handwritten note from Tobias Adler to the MIT board. "Mr. Hale is the most gifted analyst I've ever taught. He sees through equations the way some men see through lies. If he leaves now, mathematics will lose something irreplaceable." Helena's eyes blurred. The note ended abruptly as though interrupted, and beneath it, a faint pencil sketch, a boy with tired eyes holding a piece of chalk. Down in the janitor's corridor, Lucas sat beside his locker, staring at the old mop that had become both weapon and disguise. His phone buzzed with messages, interviews, scholarships, honorary offers, but he ignored them all. The world wanted the story of a miracle. He only wanted silence. Miriam Adler found him there, wrapped in that silence like a worn coat. Her voice broke it gently. "You were Tobias's student." Lucas looked up slowly, recognition flickering like candlelight. "He never treated me like a student," he said softly. "He treated me like someone who might understand." Miriam nodded, eyes wet. "He spoke of you before he died. Said there was one mind that carried his hope forward. You disappeared after your father fell ill." "No one could find you." Lucas's gaze drifted to the floor. "MIT revoked my stipend. Bills piled up. My father needed care, and after he passed, I didn't have the strength to go back. I took the first job I could find. I thought I'd lost the right to call myself a mathematician." Miriam touched his shoulder gently. "You didn't lose it, Lucas. You preserved it. In the only way you could." Meanwhile, in her office, Helena sat in the dark. She had read the file 3 times, each word heavier than the last. Every insult she had thrown, every humiliation she had inflicted, now echoed with unbearable irony. The man she had mocked was the chosen heir of the very mind that had shaped her own. When she finally stood, her reflection in the glass startled her. Not the cold perfection she used to see, but something new. A woman cracked open by truth, and perhaps reborn by it. She walked down to the janitor's corridor, not as a superior, not as a judge, but as someone seeking forgiveness. Lucas looked up when she appeared at the doorway. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Helena whispered, "I found your file." He said nothing. "You were his student, Tobias Adler's." Lucas nodded. "I was. Until I couldn't be." Helena's eyes glistened. "You never stopped being. Everything you solved, it carried his spirit. You didn't just revive mathematics, you revived him." Silence stretched between them, filled only by the hum of the corridor lights. Helena stepped closer, voice trembling. "You don't owe me forgiveness, Lucas, but if you'll allow it, I'd like to help you finish what you started." He studied her face, the pride gone, replaced by something rarer, humility. Then, quietly, he nodded. "Not as professor and janitor," he said. "As equals." News broke that afternoon. Westbridge reinstates former MIT student as visiting researcher. Dr. Voss and Mr. Hale to lead new Institute for Mathematical Inclusion. The announcement went viral, not for its publicity, but for its symbolism. A university once built on walls had opened a door. That evening, Helena and Lucas stood on the rooftop terrace overlooking the snowy campus. Lights shimmered across the lawns. The bell tower chimed 6. Helena turned to him, a faint smile breaking through. "You know, there's one equation even you haven't solved." Lucas raised an eyebrow. "Which one?" The one between two people trying to unlearn who they were told to be. He smiled, looking out at the quiet horizon. Maybe some equations aren't meant to be solved, only understood. The next day, the world would learn that mathematics wasn't reborn in a laboratory or a lecture hall, but in a janitor's heart. And Helena would learn that redemption doesn't come from being right, but from recognizing the beauty of being wrong. Because sometimes the ghost in the record isn't haunting us. It's waiting for us to come back home. In the end, the greatest proof wasn't written in chalk. It was lived in kindness. Spring arrived quietly at Westbridge. The snow that had once reflected arrogance now melted into the earth, feeding small shoots of green that crept along the stone walls. The same walls that had once kept Lucas Hale out now carried his name, etched on a bronze plaque beside a new sign, the Adler Hale Institute for Mathematical Inclusion. The doors of that small annex opened for everyone: janitors, cafeteria staff, night guards, even high school students from nearby towns. Inside, the air smelled of chalk and sunlight. Dr. Helena Voss walked through the hall slowly, her heels no longer striking marble but rubber mats scuffed by hundreds of shoes. Every step reminded her of what she had unlearned. That knowledge had never belonged to the privileged. On the board ahead, Lucas was teaching. No cameras, no competition this time. Just a circle of young faces and a man in rolled-up sleeves, explaining the same series that had once silenced an entire university. "See?" he said gently, sketching curves with slow, patient strokes. "The pattern looks infinite, but it settles into peace. It's the same with people. We bounce, we rise, we fall, but eventually, we find where we belong." The students watched in quiet awe. Helena felt something in her chest loosen, the kind of peace she hadn't felt since her first year as a researcher, before ambition had hardened into armor. After class, Lucas placed the chalk on the sill. Helena handed him a folder, the official charter of the Institute, approved and funded. "It's done," she said. "You're no longer staff. You're faculty." Lucas smiled faintly. "Titles don't mean much anymore." Helena returned the smile. "No, but the chance to rewrite who gets them, that does." That evening, as the sun slipped behind the clock tower, they sat outside on the stone steps overlooking the campus. The bell rang 6 times, the same hour it had been when she first humiliated him in that lecture hall months ago. But this time, the sound was soft. Not judgment, but forgiveness. Helena broke the silence. "You could go anywhere now. MIT, Stanford, Cambridge. Why stay here?" Lucas looked out across the fields. "Because this is where the wall fell, and if walls can fall here, they can fall anywhere." Helena turned to him, her voice barely a whisper. "You changed me, Lucas. You made me see what I had buried under perfection." He met her gaze, calm and steady. "And you gave me back what I'd buried under shame." For a long moment, neither spoke. The wind moved through the ivy, and the world seemed to hold its breath. When they rose to leave, Helena noticed the chalk he had left on the step beside her. She picked it up, smiling. "Still using the same piece?" "It's the last one from my father," he said softly. "He told me chalk is like truth. It breaks easily, but it always leaves a mark." Helena placed it gently back into his palm. "Then let's keep writing." They walked back together, professor and janitor no longer, equals in every way that mattered. Months later, their work became a quiet revolution. The Adler Hale Institute's online lectures reached millions. Prisoners, farmers, single mothers, and night shift workers wrote in, saying the same thing. "For the first time, I understand." Helena often watched Lucas from her office window, chalk dust swirling like stars as he taught. Sometimes she joined him at the board, and together they explained problems side by side. No rivalry, no titles, only light. One evening, she entered the classroom after everyone had gone. The board was half erased, but one line remained, written in Lucas's looping hand. Mathematics doesn't belong to the intelligent. It belongs to the honest. She stood there for a long time, tracing the words with her fingertip. Then, in smaller letters beneath it, she added, "And to those who dare to forgive." Years later, visitors would still stop by the small annex on the west lawn of Westbridge University. They would see a simple framed photograph. Lucas Hale and Helena Voss standing beside a chalkboard under the afternoon sun, smiling. No trophies, no medals. Only two people who had learned that the most beautiful equations are not found in numbers, but in grace.